Hello everyone. I'm just going to give it a couple of minutes to make sure that everyone can hear me, that you are connected. This is our very first live here on Lavinia Latham JD. Of course, my name is Lavinia Latham. I'm a human rights lawyer based here in Canada, specifically Ontario. Today we are going to be talking about the ugly truth about intention versus impact. Now, if you are logging on, please feel free to let me know, hop into the chat, and just, introduce yourself if you feel comfortable. If not, of course, that's okay too. Just jumping on into this at the very basic, at the core level of what intention versus impact is. Intention is what you aim to achieve through an action, whereas impact is how a person or a community receives that particular action. So when we're talking about impact versus intention as it relates to human rights law, as it relates to equity, we really aren't concerned, we're not overly concerned with how it relates to the intentions of the individuals and the discriminatory action. We are more talking about the impact of that discriminatory action. And so, given the fact that I am based in Ontario, I am an Ontario human rights lawyer, the crux of today's conversation is going to really focus on Ontario human rights law. I see Carl Alphonse is in the chat. Thank you so much for joining, Carl. I really appreciate your support today in this morning, or this afternoon rather. So jumping right along into it, what is the Ontario Human Rights Code? Well, the Ontario Human Rights Code is a piece of legislation that really provides the law around human rights in Ontario. The Ontario Human Rights Code is a prime piece of legislation. It does override any other provisions, provincially speaking, that have to do with human rights. Additionally, we also have the Canadian Human Rights Act, but if that's something you're interested in, then definitely continue staying tuned to my channel, Lavinia Latham JD, and I will absolutely delve a little bit further into that to increase some understanding, awareness, capacity around those items. So, the Ontario Human Rights Code has 5 social areas that provide for equality and freedom from discrimination in goods, services, and facilities, housing, contracts, employment, unions, and professional associations. So, really, we're talking about this extended environment. Now, when we're talking about these social areas are very important because the Ontario Human Rights Code only applies as it relates to these specific social areas. So if we're outside of the social areas that I just mentioned, being goods, services, and facilities, housing, contracts, employment, and unions and professional associations, then we are now outside of the jurisdiction, the parameters, so to speak, of the Ontario Human Rights Code. So the Ontario Human Rights Code, we know where it applies. So we know that it applies in those 5 social areas that I just mentioned, but what are the grounds? So grounds relate to the specific area of discrimination. While one might feel that are being discriminated against based on their weight, for example, unfortunately, that is not a ground under the Ontario Human Rights Code, which means that the Ontario Human Rights Code does not provide protections for that particular area of discrimination. So, what are the grounds then? The grounds include disability, age, sex, gender identity, gender expression, sexual orientation, marital status, family status, creed, race, color, ancestry, ethnic origin, citizenship, place of origin, public assistance, and record of offenses. So, of course, society is always changing. There's an ebb and flow in terms of, how much, socioeconomical fallout can happen from a certain type of discrimination. And so, for that reason, there's always case law that's coming through the pipelines, through the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal, that works towards adding to this list of particular grounds. Now, the grounds that I am focused on that you will hear a lot about here on my channel is related to anti-Black racism. That is my area of expertise. However, I do also work within the parameters of other areas or other grounds. So moving right along, now that we know what grounds are, how do we even know if discrimination takes place? Now, if you are someone who identifies as an individual outside of the white race. If you are somebody who identifies as perhaps with one of the grounds that I mentioned, then you might inherently know when you're experiencing discrimination, but that doesn't necessarily mean that, again, it would fall within the legislative definition, the test, the legal test, so to speak, of discrimination. Now, discrimination, we're going to hop back over to what we were talking about before as it relates to social areas. So, discrimination is one of those 5 social areas, plus one of the codified grounds, which I just mentioned earlier, and differential impact. So, if you can prove as the applicant that you've experienced some form of discrimination, some form of a differential impact within one of the social areas and on one of the grounds that I mentioned, then you may have a case for discrimination. Now, I'm going to pause this conversation ever so slightly to just put the disclaimer out there that none of this information is legal advice. I am a lawyer, however, I am not your lawyer. This is legal information. If you are in a circumstance where you require legal representation, an advocate, then I would absolutely advise you to reach out to a lawyer who can look at the circumstances of your case, determine the merits of your case, knowing all that's happening, and then provide you with legal advice accordingly. However, this particular video right here on YouTube is only for informational purposes and not for the sake of being providing representation. And if you want a little bit more information about that, you can absolutely check the About section of this YouTube channel, which will also have some more information about the fact that I am not your lawyer. I'm simply providing informational, legal information. So, that being said, jumping right back into the presentation again, discrimination is really treating someone unfairly relating to personal characteristics that are a part of those codified grounds. So, returning back to that example that I made about the weight, while it might be, you may have experienced weight or unfortunate or very inequitable comments related to your weight in a workplace setting. Maybe you felt that it was unfair and you were treated differently. It wouldn't necessarily amount at this moment to a codified infraction. There wouldn't be any legal remedies before the Human Rights Tribunal based on the ground of weight, because that ground doesn't exist. Now, interestingly enough, there is some cases that are starting to come down the pipeline. Some really intelligent and creative lawyers are making the argument that this should indeed be a ground. However, we are just not there yet. So, discrimination is really treating someone unfairly related to one of the grounds by either imposing a burden or denying a privilege, benefit, or an opportunity enjoyed by others. So, imposing a burden could be something to the effect of, something. This is a hot button topic right now. You as a Black student, or any student for that matter, is not allowed to wear any headscarves, coverings to class. You are to go to class with no headscarves, no do-rags. That would be imposing a burden on students with Afro-textured hair, because these students need these particular head coverings in order to maintain their hair, in order to really do something aesthetic and get back to class, get back to their studies as soon as possible. And so, not kind of getting into the weeds of that too much, but that would be a particular burden for only students with Afro-textured hair, because only students with Afro-textured hair would have a bona fide need to wear a do-rag or a head covering, anything of that nature. The other thing it could be that we mentioned was denying a privilege, benefit, or opportunity enjoyed by others. So, a very straightforward example of this could be, all students are able to go on this trip except for students who identify as Sikh, with the Sikh religion. They're not able to go on this trip because they're not Catholic. That would be a direct discrimination. It would be a form of discrimination that is not in alignment with the provisions of the Ontario Human Rights Code. So, discrimination can be direct, it could be indirect, it could be subtle, and it can also be unintentional. And there are various different ways in which that can be, but we always return back to the argument, or back to the test rather, which is intention versus impact. And again, that's intention related to, it doesn't really matter what the individual was intending to say. It doesn't matter what they thought they were saying. No, really, what this particular legal test for discrimination comes down to is what was the impact on the individual who identifies with one of the grounds that were listed earlier. So, forms of discrimination, you can see things like harassment, poisoned environment, systemic discrimination, reprisal, condemnation. All of these things relate to the impact. Was there an impact of harassment? Was there an impact that the person felt they were in a poisoned environment? Was there an impact of systemic discrimination or reprisal or condemnation? Oftentimes, I keep drilling this point down because oftentimes when we're having conversations about intention versus impact, it really does come back to, well, I didn't intend to offend, or I didn't intend to commit systemic discrimination, or I didn't intend for that individual to be in a situation whereby it was reprisal. Again, it's the impact, not the intention. So, systemic discrimination, the Ontario Human Rights Commission has some policy and guidelines, specifically in the area of racism and racial discrimination. And it identifies three considerations for identifying and assessing systemic discrimination. Um, this is not within the purview of today's conversation. If you are interested in learning more about that, definitely let me know by just leaving a comment in the comment section down below, and I will be sure to respond, and I will be sure to put together some more content that may help you along your journey of perhaps getting involved in human rights law, because the more the merrier. So, we know a little bit about the Ontario Human Rights Code, but where does that piece of legislation like to play? Well, that piece of legislation likes to play within the Human Rights Tribunal, which we refer to with the acronym the HRTO. And the HRTO is a really fantastic place because it really does assist individuals with accessing the law by themselves. So, like, it's really a people's court, so to speak. Now, of course, us lawyers have kind of gone in there and kind of muddied things up a little bit in the sense that it's not as accessible as it used to be. Just because the law is forever changing, there are ways to write applications, there are ways to prove whether or not you, as the applicant, have actually experienced discrimination. And there's a really particular way to draft what we call the factum, which is essentially going to go into your application. Now, all that being said, for the purposes of today's video, the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal really can only consider a claim, so your application, if it, one, falls within the scope of the code, and two, has the legal authority, so the jurisdiction, to deal with it. So, if you have something that occurred in British Columbia, for example, or in Quebec, or, for my Americans who might be watching today's video, if you have something that occurred in New York City, well, unfortunately, you wouldn't be able to bring your claim of discrimination before the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal because it lacks the legal authority, aka the jurisdiction, to deal with that particular matter. Now, if your issue falls outside of the scope of the human rights code, then again, the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal would not be able to deal with that. So the Human Rights Tribunal does not deal with civil claims. They don't deal with any piece of legislation outside of the Ontario Human Rights Code. It really is a tribunal that is directly in alignment with the Ontario Human Rights Code. I hope that makes sense. And if it doesn't, please let me know in the comment section down below. So, the HRTO cannot consider an application if that application does not relate to one of the grounds of discrimination. So, for example, race, disability, gender identity, or to an area. So, like we mentioned before, those 5 social areas, housing, or employment. It really does have to be covered by that Ontario Human Rights Code. Now, another reason why the HRTO might not be able to deal with an application is if the events have no connection to Ontario. Returning back to that example that I made earlier about New York City and not being able to bring those claims within Ontario. Another reason could be that the respondent, so this would be another word for defendant, is a chartered bank, airline, television or radio station, telephone company, a company that operates buses and railways that travel between the provinces, or is another company that is subject to federal laws. Now, you may be wondering, well, why? Aren't those things falling within the 5 social areas? Yes, you would absolutely be correct in thinking that. However, we do have special legislation and a special tribunal that is only for federal issues, and that is the Canadian Human Rights Act, which is a federal piece of legislation, and then we've got the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, which is the federal tribunal. So I hope that makes sense. And those pieces, the chartered bank, the airline, the television and radio stations, those are all federal powers. Those are all fall within federal jurisdiction, which is why it wouldn't be able to be brought before the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal. Another reason why the HRTO cannot consider an application is if the human rights claim is before the courts or is the subject of another decision. Now, the court system, the tribunal system, they don't do duplicate decisions. If there is a decision or an ongoing matter on the exact same case, then that has to resolve or go through its processes first, and then they follow a more linear appeal type process. So if one wanted to bring a case before the tribunal and before the civil court at the exact same time on the exact same issues, that would be a no-go as well. Another reason why, so those are the reasons, those are the four of the main reasons why the tribunal may decide not to consider an application. Now, there is a limitation period, and a limitation period really means the time frame that one is allowed to bring a claim before it expires. So if something happened to you, something discriminatory occurred it, within a year ago, then you absolutely have enough time to launch an application. Now, if a year has passed, you would have to make an argument. So you would have to bring a motion before the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal to explain to the vice chair why exactly are you bringing a claim that's outside of 1 year. Now, you must file your application within 1 year of when the alleged discrimination happened. However, if the discrimination happened and it's ongoing, then that clock starts at the very last instance of discrimination. So it's good in the sense that the timeline is always moving forward, and we're always looking at what was the chain of events and when was the last chain of events, because that's when things will continue to tick, which is a very important distinction. And again, if you're interested in learning more about that, definitely let me know in the comment section. So, in terms of the tribunal, there's a mediation process that you can either opt into as an applicant or you can opt out of. Legal information, I always advise people that they should, tick for mediation because it looks good in the eyes of the tribunal that one is actually working towards a resolution and isn't just litigious in nature. And it does absolutely help for the resolution of the matter in a more timely fashion as opposed to waiting longer and, the drawn out process that it can be when traditional litigation commences. Now, all of this information I know is a lot. You came here to learn about intention versus impact, and now you're learning about the Ontario Human Rights Code and the tribunal, and it could be overwhelming. Not to worry, we do have something called the Ontario Human Rights Legal Support Center, and I'm sorry, it's the Human Rights Legal Support Center, so HRLSC. And that particular support center is available to assist individuals with claims before the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal. So if you're interested in that, you can get direct legal advice, which again, this video is not. You can receive free legal advice about your particular matter. You can also use the services of Legal Aid Ontario, which will give you access to any one of the specialized clinics that oftentimes deal with discrimination as per the code. So there's a lot of free information available. There's free legal representation available within Ontario, which is a fantastic thing that the government has taken responsibility for the things that people inevitably will experience by no fault of their own. You may also connect with a private lawyer. Sometimes private lawyers are willing to take on cases pro bono, depending on the merits of the case, perhaps the chances of success, amongst other factors, or even a paralegal. So paralegals are able to navigate the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal. However, there's always different options available to you depending on what your comfort level is, and of course, depending on what your economic situation is as well. So that really is the, I guess, crux of what we're here to talk about today. Thank you so much for joining me. If you do have any residual questions, this video will be available for your viewing pleasures. If you enjoyed this or you think there's someone who may benefit from this information, please feel free to send them on over to my channel. This is Lavinia Latham JD, and I would be happy to provide further assistance. Also, you can visit my website for even more information about receiving legal advice, and that's Lavinia Latham. I'm just going to put it into the chat here right now. That's lavinialatham.com. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.